Okay, so you want to own a medieval vineyard. You picture rolling rows of vines under a warm sun, a cellar of aging barrels, a trade built on patience and taste. Then you open one surviving abbey ledger. A newly planted vineyard in medieval Burgundy took, on average, 4 to 5 years before it produced a usable harvest, and closer to a decade before it produced wine worth selling at a premium price. That's the part the romantic version leaves out. This wasn't a business you could start on a season's notice and walk away from if the harvest failed. It was one of the longest, most capital-intensive commitments a medieval landholder could make, and the people who actually got rich from it were rarely the ones pruning the vines. The vine was never the business. The patience was. Let's build one and prove it. One vineyard, a few acres on a good slope, the labor to plant and tend it, and the institution that most often ended up owning the land beneath it, somewhere in Burgundy or the Rhineland, sometime in the 1200s. By the end, you'll have the real ledger. What it cost to plant and wait, where the actual profit came from, the single relationship that decided whether you got rich or went broke, and why the person collecting the money was almost never the one who'd done the digging. First, let's kill the image of the independent peasant vintner tending his own little plot for his own little profit. Across medieval Europe, and especially in the great wine regions of Burgundy, the Rhineland, and Bordeaux, the largest and most consistently profitable vineyards weren't owned by individual farmers at all. Monastic institutions, the Cistercians above all, held title to some of the most valuable vineyard land in Europe, often accumulated acre by acre through donations from nobles seeking prayers for their souls, then consolidated and managed with a level of long-term planning almost no individual smallholder could match. The Cistercian abbey of Cîteaux, for instance, built up one of the most celebrated vineyard holdings in Burgundy over generations, a site so prized it's still producing wine under a related name today, nearly 9 centuries later. That's the first number that reframes everything. The barrier to real wealth in this trade wasn't the vine. It was owning enough contiguous land, held long enough, by an institution that would never die, sell in a panic, or need the harvest money to survive a bad year. So who actually planted and worked the vines? Almost never the landholder himself. Monastic and noble vineyard owners overwhelmingly relied on a system of tenant labor, sometimes free peasants working under a sharecropping arrangement called complant, in which the tenant planted and tended the vines in exchange for a portion of the eventual harvest, sometimes as much as half, once the vines finally began producing. This is the clause that decided everything. The tenant absorbed years of unpaid labor and total crop risk during the long, unproductive establishment period, while the landowner risked comparatively little beyond the land itself, and then collected a substantial share of the harvest for as long as the vines kept producing, which for well-tended vines could be decades. Once again, the person doing the physical work carried the early risk. The person holding the deed collected the long-term reward. Now price the actual operation, because a vineyard's cost structure looked nothing like a wheat field's. Preparing the ground for planting required extensive labor, clearing, terracing on hillsides, and driving in wooden stakes to support each row of vines, since medieval viticulture relied heavily on staking and training vines upward rather than letting them sprawl. Then came the vines themselves, propagated from cuttings, planted at high density, and requiring careful tending, weeding, pruning, staking repairs, every single year for 4 or 5 years before any harvest at all, and several more years after that before the vines reached full productive maturity. Compare that to a wheat field, which could be plowed, sown, and harvested inside a single year, or even the tavern and blacksmith trades this channel has covered before, where a modest opening outlay could start generating income within weeks. A vineyard demanded years of pure expense and pure labor before it returned a single coin. That upfront patience is exactly why the trade favored institutions with deep reserves and no need for quick returns over ordinary peasant farmers who needed every field working for food that same year. The other major cost sat underground, quite literally: storage and pressing. Wine needed a press. casks or barrels for fermentation and aging, and a cool cellar to hold it in. Infrastructure that represented a serious capital outlay on top of the vines themselves, an infrastructure that scaled far more efficiently for a large monastic or noble estate producing hundreds of barrels a year than for a single tenant farmer producing a handful. This is the second quiet advantage that pushed real vineyard wealth toward institutional owners, not just the land and the patience, but the pressing and cellaring infrastructure that made large-scale production dramatically more cost-efficient per barrel than small-scale production ever could be. Now, the twist most people miss entirely: medieval vineyard wealth wasn't really built on selling wine by the cup in a local tavern. It was built on long-distance, high-value trade to wealthy and often distant buyers, and on the extraordinary tax and toll privileges the largest ecclesiastical owners could secure. Great monastic vineyards produced wine explicitly destined for export, down the Rhine, along river networks to Paris, or across the English Channel to London, where Bordeaux's wine trade in particular became one of medieval England's largest single categories of import, protected and encouraged for centuries by English royal policy because the crown taxed every barrel that crossed the water. A cask of quality wine that sold for a modest price near the vineyard itself could sell for many multiples of that price once it reached a distant urban market with wealthy buyers and no local vineyards of its own. Distance wasn't a cost to be minimized here. It was the entire source of the markup. Climb the actual revenue ladder then, because the vineyard wasn't one flat business. At the bottom sat the everyday local wine, lower quality, sold cheaply and close to home, the equivalent of the blacksmith's nails, constant but thin margin. In the middle sat wines sold to regional merchants and taverns, already carrying a healthier markup once someone else took on the cost of transport. At the top sat the export trade to distant, wealthy markets, where a single well-timed shipment to London or Paris could return a multiple of what the same wine would have earned sold locally by the cask. The great monastic estates positioned themselves deliberately at that top tier, cultivating reputations for specific vineyards and specific quality that let them command premium prices centuries before anyone used the word brand. Burgundian abbey vineyards were already being singled out by name and praised above their neighbor's wine in surviving medieval accounts. Exactly the kind of reputation effect that let an owner charge more for what was, agriculturally speaking, a very similar product to the vineyard next door. There's a further layer above even that, and it's the one that made the very largest vineyard fortunes durable across centuries rather than just profitable in a good year: tax and toll exemption. Major monastic institutions frequently secured exemptions or reductions on the tolls charged for transporting goods along rivers and roads, privileges granted by kings and nobles in exchange for prayers, political support, or simple piety. And those exemptions applied directly to wine shipments heading toward the most lucrative distant markets. A toll exemption on every cask moving down the Rhine or the Seine wasn't a one-time discount. It was a permanent structural cost advantage over every rival producer who had to pay the full toll on every single shipment, year after year, for as long as the exemption held. In a trade defined by the markup gained through distance, controlling or eliminating the cost of that distance was arguably worth more than owning slightly better land. Worth pausing on the complant arrangement itself because it's the clearest illustration of how risk and reward split between the two parties over the life of a vineyard. In the first years, before any harvest arrived, the tenant's labor was effectively an interest-free loan to the landowner, repaid not in coin, but in a future share of grapes that might never materialize if frost, disease, or war intervened first. Surviving complant contracts from Burgundy and neighboring regions typically specified the exact division of the future harvest, commonly splitting it roughly in half between tenant and landowner once the vines matured, but said comparatively little about compensating the tenant if the vines failed before reaching that point. The landowner's downside in a failed establishment was the opportunity cost of unused land. The tenant's downside was several years of labor with nothing to show for it. That asymmetry, repeated across a monastic estate's dozens or hundreds of tenant plots, is a large part of how these institutions could keep expanding their vineyard holdings without needing to fund the expansion themselves. It's also worth being specific about how reputation compounded into real pricing power, because this is where the largest medieval vineyard fortunes diverge most sharply from ordinary agricultural income. A monastery that had spent generations refining which slopes produced the best grapes, which pressing techniques yielded the cleanest wine, and which barrels aged best could charge a premium that had nothing to do with that particular year's growing conditions and everything to do with accumulated institutional knowledge no individual tenant farmer working a single plot for a single lifetime could ever replicate. This is the same mechanism, in miniature, that would later define the great named wine estates of early modern and modern Europe. The land mattered, but the multi-generational institutional memory sitting on top of the land mattered just as much. And that kind of memory only accumulates inside an organization built to outlast any single person's working life. Now, the risk side, because this trade carried some of the sharpest exposure of any medieval business this channel has examined. A late frost could destroy an entire year's crop after 4 or 5 years of unpaid establishment labor had already been sunk into the vines, with nothing to show for the season and no fast way to recover it, since replanting meant starting the multi-year wait all over again. Disease was a constant threat long before anyone understood its causes. Vine diseases recorded across medieval sources could devastate a vineyard's output with no reliable remedy available, and a bad outbreak could set an estate back years. War and passing armies posed a uniquely severe risk specific to vineyards. Unlike grain fields, which could sometimes be replanted the following season, even after being trampled or burned, mature vines represented years of accumulated investment that couldn't be replaced quickly, making a vineyard a catastrophic single-event loss in a way that a wheat field, however painful to lose, generally wasn't. Contemporary accounts from periods of prolonged conflict, including stretches of the 100 Years' War in French wine regions, describe vineyards abandoned or destroyed as armies moved through, with recovery measured in years rather than seasons. Political and market risk sat over the whole enterprise as well. Royal policy could reshape an entire regional wine trade with a single decision. English royal preference for Bordeaux wine, secured through the marriage that briefly brought Aquitaine under English control, created and sustained an enormous export market for centuries. And that same market largely evaporated for English buyers once English control of the region ended during the 100 Years' War, a political shift no individual vineyard owner had any power to prevent. A producer whose fortune depended on one royal trade relationship could watch that fortune shrink dramatically the moment the underlying political arrangement changed, with no recourse beyond hoping for a new buyer at a comparable price. So, could you get rich owning a medieval vineyard? Yes, but overwhelmingly as an institution rather than an individual, and overwhelmingly through patience and land accumulation rather than any single good harvest. The real wealth sat with monastic estates and great noble landholders who could absorb 4 or 5 unproductive years without needing the income, who owned enough contiguous acreage to justify pressing and cellaring infrastructure at efficient scale, who secured toll exemptions that permanently undercut every competitor's transport costs, and who built reputations specific enough to command premium prices in distant markets decades or centuries before the concept of a wine brand existed. The tenant who actually planted and tended the vines under a complant arrangement took on years of unpaid labor and the worst of the frost, disease, and war risk in exchange for a share of a harvest that might not arrive for half a decade. The abbey that held the deed took on comparatively little, waited out the same years with resources it didn't desperately need, and then collected a share of premium export revenue for as long as those vines kept producing, which for a well-sited, well-tended vineyard could be the better part of a century. Look back at the Burgundian hillside one last time, without the sunlight on the vines. A medieval vineyard was never really a farmer's trade at all. It was one of the purest patience businesses the medieval economy produced, a slow compounding asset that punished anyone without the reserves to wait it out, and rewarded disproportionately and for generations. Whichever institution could afford to plant a vine today, for a harvest it might not sell for a decade. The grape sold what everyone assumes it sold. The land underneath it sold something else entirely. 5 years of patience, a toll exemption, and a name distant buyers had learned to trust. The vine was never the business. The wait was.